All right, so we are here for a debate between Zach and Classical Theist on the resolution if formal heresy deposes the Pope of his office ipso facto, with Brother Zachary taking the affirmative and Classical Theist taking the negative. We'll begin with introductions. Brother Zachary, if you would like to begin.
Yes, okay. So I just like to begin by first putting forward that we're not debating the issue of sedevacantism. We are debating an issue of whether or not a pope can be a manifest heretic. And if a pope is a manifest heretic, whether or not he's deposed ipso facto. Okay, this has nothing to do about whether or not the current popes, the post-Vatican II popes are anti-popes, and that's outside the scope of this debate. Now, I believe that I can establish, using church dogma, to prove that it is the case that if someone who claims to be the pontiff manifests heresy, he is ipso facto deposed. And I derive this from Mystici Corporis Christi number 22 from Pope Pius XII, which states that only those are to be included as members of the church who have been baptized and profess the true faith, and who have not been so unfortunate as to separate themselves from the unity of the body. Okay? And Satis Cognitum number 15, which then says, from Pope Leo XIII, that no one, therefore, unless in communion with Peter, can share in his authority, since it is absurd to imagine that he who is outside the church can command within the church. Okay? There are other papal documents such as Auctorum Fide, which address the issue of, well, then if that is the case, no one can judge the Roman See. Okay? But we know that when it is said that no one can judge the Roman See, as it's said in Vatican I, what it actually means is that none of the bishops can call the true pope, a true and valid pope, to trial. Right? But we know that according to Auctorum Fide from Pope Pius VI, that whenever it becomes necessary to expose statements that disguise some suspected error or danger under the veil of ambiguity, one must denounce the perverse meaning under which the error opposed to the Catholic truth is camouflaged. So obviously this doesn't require that we wait for some proclamation or whatever to judge error or heresy when we see error or heresy. And now finally, I think that the final thing bolstering my position is the fact that this is the position held by St. Robert Bellarmine, the position held by St. Cyprian, the position held by Opotus, Ambrose, Augustine, Jerome, that anyone who is a heretic cannot govern within the church. And so that's all I have to say for my opening statements. It's rather brief, but that's because this is a simple issue. Church dogma is very clear about this issue.
All right, Classical Theist, if you'd like to read your statement.
Right. Well, I have pretty much three basic arguments that I'm going to put forward as to the antithesis of the resolution. And my first argument is basically that the notion that formal heresy automatically deposes a pope without further sentencing, I think, would render papal infallibility itself essentially impotent. And this is because in order to assent to any instance of papal infallibility on the sedevacantist position, this would be conditional upon the faithful's willingness to accept or deny it. And that's because if a Catholic has predetermined that the content of the apparent dogma, if he has already established that to be heretical prior to its pronouncement as a dogma, then the Catholic can simply regard the Pope as having lost his office prior to pronouncing it, given the fact that formal heresy automatically would have deposed the Pope anyway. So let's say they interpret, in light of their reading of Scripture, the Fathers, or the Church Councils, that the content of the apparent dogma is irreconcilable with what has been revealed in these texts. If now the Pope contradicts their reading of those texts, then it has to be at least possible on the sedevacantist view that the lay Catholic is correct and that the Pope is actually pronouncing heresy. because if the Pope does not pronounce heresy, then he would just cease to be Pope anyway. So that would essentially make the dogmatic character of an apparent infallible pronouncement simply subject to the whim of the subject, which I think would render papal infallibility itself impotent. Now, and we can get into examples and hypotheticals if necessary. So the second argument, just very briefly, is that if formal heresy is sufficient to depose a pope, then that would mean that we could have really no certain knowledge as to the validity of any given pontificate, because formal heresy can be either occult, that is, in private, or publicly manifest. And either of these would sever one from Christ's church. If John Smith, for example, personally doesn't believe in the Trinity, but professes belief in the Trinity externally, that external profession does not suffice to make him Catholic. He ceases to be Catholic at the very moment he internally rejects the Trinity, unbeknownst to anyone. But if he ceases to be Catholic, then on sedevacantist logic, he cannot even in principle hold any office in the church, since he could not be the head over that of which he is not a member. And there are even cases in church history where the personal orthodoxy of various popes can certainly be held into question. Perhaps we'll get into those. And finally, the third argument, again, briefly, even supposing that formal heresy does not automatically depose a pope, I simply see no sufficient irrefutable proof, that any of the recent popes have fallen into express formal heresy, that is to say, rejecting a dogma knowingly and willingly as a dogma. I understand that the resolution of the debate is in the abstract, but I don't think we can completely escape the current circumstance under which the sedevacantist position is available to us. But since you do want to get away from that, I guess I'll omit the third argument for now. But we'll probably end up touching on it.
Okay. Well, I just want to remind you that you were the one who created this resolution. I had asked you, and you created this resolution, and it is beyond the scope. I mean, if we want to have a second debate on that, that can happen. But again, your third point
I
is
understand
that
the
is outside
resolution
the scope.
but I just don't think the resolution can be completely severed from the current circumstance. But we don't have to.
It is a separate issue because we're dealing with whether or not a pope who manifests heresy would cease to be the pope. My argument is quite simple, which is that do you believe that to govern within the church you have to be a member of the church?
My position is essentially that in order to govern in the church, you have to have jurisdiction within the church. Now, that can be either supplied from without or inherent from within. I think formal heresy would render one undeserving of jurisdiction. But in order for that to be manifest to the faithful, that would have to be declared by the church. And if that's not the case, then I think you have to deal with the logical problems that I put forth.
Okay. Well, the issue there then is that no one can judge the Roman See. That's dogmatic according to the First Vatican Council. So if it's the case that for a pope to be deposed, he has to be, I mean, how could he be judged then, right? And secondarily, I just want to point out that historically, the position that the church has taken is that upon the manifestation of heresy, they lose their inherent jurisdiction, right? And that is not to say, though, that people who are non-members of the church can have supplied jurisdiction, but all supplied jurisdiction is, for example, let's say that you're near death and the only person who could, give you the sacrament of confession is a priest who had been excommunicated, right? Then jurisdiction would be supplied in that case, and that would be, you would be able to validly receive the sacrament from him. That's all supplied jurisdiction is. It isn't something which maintains after the sacrament or whatever, right? So we're talking about an inherent jurisdiction here, and I also, you brought up the distinction between occult and public and occult heresy, right? Which is actually, this is an important distinction, because when we're dealing with canon law, right, we have to deal purely in the external forum, because it's like you said, it's impossible for any of us to know the internal forum, let alone the occult dealings, of a person. We can't know the internal forum, which is why we're talking about, canonical proceedings and stuff like that. When we're talking about issues regarding the Pope, regarding any canon irregularities such as heresy or schism, right, we're dealing with the external forum only, unless it is the case that it can be sufficiently proven that the internal forum is contradictory to the external forum. So this would be, for example, if someone in the external forum held a heretical position, however, upon hearing the Catholic position, immediately took the Catholic position and renounced their heresy, we would then be able to determine with sufficient, proof that their internal forum was inconsistent with their external forum, right? And like you said, it essentially gets to a guessing game then of whether or not a person actually is a Catholic. But the issue here is that just because we can't know, the internal forum of a given person doesn't mean that we don't judge them. They're actually assumed to be guilty until proven otherwise, if their external actions or their professions in the external forums, prove them to be a heretic. Their internal forum is assumed to be consistent unless proven otherwise, and which is why, canon law doesn't deal with the internal forum, because it necessarily couldn't, because to say that something is only in the internal forum or in the occult implies that nobody knows about it. So how could we even begin to deal with it? It's almost a bit of an absurdity to bring that forward.
What you're saying is that the reason formal heresy would automatically depose a pope is precisely because the heretical pope would then be severed from the church, and he cannot be the head over that of which he is not a member. But the problem is that formal heresy, without its external manifestation, would suffice to sever him from the church. Would it not?
Yeah, of course it would.
Okay, then how could he remain pope?
Yeah, okay, but this is the issue that we're dealing with here, is that we would never know. There's no way, if for example, the Pope was the Antichrist, but he never uttered any heresies, okay, we would never know. No one would ever say that the Antichrist, could be the Pope, right? But the fact of the matter is that how would we know to deal with these sorts of hypotheticals? It doesn't follow.
There are clear cases in church history where popes have expressed heretical things.
Well, yeah, obviously, but then it's in the
such as, for
forum.
example, no, I'm talking about expressing a heretical proposition.
What do you mean? How would that not be in the external forum?
Well, what I'm saying is that is indeed in the external forum, but my point is that popes in history have proposed heretical propositions externally.
Well, what's an example of that, so we know exactly what you're referring to?
Oh, well, one very quick example would be
John the 22nd, maybe?
Well, I was going to go with... this is in some degree of dispute, but again, if this is a question of mere probabilities, then I think that's running or taking a bit of a risk with respect to the gates of hell not prevailing against the church. And that example would be Pope Nicholas I on the question of baptism. Denzinger 335 to the letter of the Bulgarians. He says, "You assert in your fatherland, many have been baptized by a certain Jew. You do not know whether Christian or pagan, and you consult to us as to what should be done to him, or what should be done about them. If indeed they have been baptized in the name of the Holy Trinity, or only in the name of Christ, as we read in the Acts of the Apostles, it is established that they not be baptized again." Now, that is clearly in contradiction to what the Church teaches regarding the validity of baptism, that the baptismal formula is only valid if done in the name of the Trinity. And with my position, it doesn't matter whether Pope Nicholas I knowingly rejected that doctrine or not, because on my view, his jurisdiction as Pope would remain with him until removed by the Church in the future council. And the way that would happen, it's not really a situation in which the Church has superiority over the Pope, because of course the Holy See is not judged by anybody. What it would be is that when the Pope is suspected of being a heretic, the Church has an obligation to discern whether or not this is truly the case, as to whether or not he is truly a formal heretic. Now, if the Church has discerned through its legitimate hierarchy, mind you, that the Pope has fallen into heresy, then the Church has the right to avoid him, to separate herself from him. And in that case, once the Church has made that judgment, in order that it must sever herself from him, at that point, the Pope would be considered deposed in accord with natural law, and in accord with what Christ says about, or not what Christ himself says. I believe it's St. Paul, where he says regarding avoiding heretics.
Well, again, you have this issue, right, is where Nicholas I don't know much about the situation, but in this situation, Nicholas I seems to clearly be a heretic, as in the case of Honorius, who as well, there have been other popes throughout history have even been anathematized, formally recognized and anathematized, right, by manifesting heresy. The issue that we're getting into here is that, as I've said earlier, it's dogmatic that no one can judge a true pontiff, right? And secondarily, the requirements for being a pontiff is that you are, one, baptized, and that you profess the true faith. So by ceasing to profess the true faith, one is no longer a member of the Church, because Mystici Corporis Christi number 22 explicitly says that only those, it doesn't make any exception, only those are to be included as members of the Church who have been baptized and profess the true faith, right? Clearly, in this example that you've put forward, he's not professing the true faith. And in Satis Cognitum number 15, no one, therefore, unless in communion with Peter, can share in his authority, since it is absurd to imagine that he who is outside the Church can command in the Church. Okay, and those are both, dogmatic.
I don't think they're dogmatic. I don't think they are.
Okay, well, I thought that you would say that, and the issue with that is that the First Vatican Council says that so long as it is the Pope, speaking as the head of the Church to the universal Church on a matter of faith or morals, okay, it's dogmatic. And that is, Satis Cognitum and Mystici Corporis Christi were written to the universal Church, by each of the respective pontiffs as the head of the Church.
You're missing out. You're excluding a very key ingredient in papal infallibility, and that is that he defines as to be definitively believed by the faithful. I can read to you the explicit parameters of papal infallibility as outlined in Vatican I. I don't see how
Yeah, he
that
defines a doctrine concerning faith and
defines,
morals
that
to be
has to
held
be
by the whole
explicit
church.
that he is
Okay,
defining it.
okay. So then you hold to the position. I mean, what documents then are what's dogmatic then? Like,
Well, all of the canons of the Council of Trent that have anathemas with them, that's one example. Another example is very clearly, goes without saying, the assumption in the Immaculate
but
Conception.
what's the difference? What's the difference between the Council of Trent's canons and Mystici Corporis Christi and Satis Cognitum? Look,
Because in those canons, they explicitly express their intention that they are defining and binding the faithful to these propositions.
okay, but how is it the case that these documents are not meant? How is it that these are being written in a way that is not meant to be binding to all the faithful? I hear this commonly among people who hold to the position that you do, which is that either the Novus Ordo popes or the popes in previous have to not be speaking ex cathedra to maintain the position that they do. Look, you have to realize there are so many papal proclamations which would not fall under ex cathedra. Like, do you believe that Peter, when he spoke against the Judaizing heresy in the Council of Jerusalem, he wasn't speaking ex cathedra then, right? Because he didn't say, I'm defining a dogma to be believed by all the faithful.
Well,
He
the
didn't mention
intention of
that
the
at all.
council is to bind the whole church. That was clearly the express intention of what St. Peter was saying there. It was to bind the faithful to...
Where does he say that?
Well, that's the intention of the council. And that's the intention of a church.
I can say that that's the intention
council.
of the encyclical, or the intention of the bull, right? Why is he writing the bull? He's writing it to instruct the faithful on matters of faith and morals. That's why they exist. So I don't see how you're making the distinction that you seem to be making is very arbitrary and actually puts you in a very precarious position where I think a lot of things that we would all consider dogma, like the fact that you can't hold to the old covenant, etc., would like not be dogmatic under this definition. Like such a small number of things. Like, and I'm not even sure if the Council of Trent's canons like would like what language specifically is required. Like, we also know that we are called not to follow the letter of the law. Like, there isn't like, we don't have to say abracadabra before a papal pronouncement to make it dogmatic. There isn't like a magical keyword. When the Pope is speaking to the universal church and he's defining, something to be believed by the universal church, okay, on a matter of faith and morals, it's a dogma. Why else would it be written if it's not? This is a rhetorical question. Why else would it be written and promulgated to the universal church as the head of the universal church if it's not to be believed by the faithful? It's obviously to be believed by the faithful, because like there's so many proclamations which don't include that. And there are actually some proclamations which do include that, which I think would be very damning to your position, like quo primum, for example. Although this is outside the scope of the debate, to someone holding the Novus Ordo position, quo primum is very damning, and it uses even more solemn language than Mystici Corporis Christi or Satis Cognitum does.
As regards liturgical discipline, mind you.
Okay, that's a very odd way to phrase it, because the liturgy, because the liturgy is a matter of faith. It is a matter of faith.
Not liturgical discipline. Liturgical discipline is related to matters of faith, but it is not in and of itself a matter of faith as regards to deposit of faith.
The canons of the Mass are a matter of faith. Liturgical discipline is not the canons of the Mass. Liturgical disciplines, it's things like the rubrics, things like, holy days of obligation, whether or not there will be abrogations for stuff like that, etc. That's liturgical discipline. The
specific wording of the canons of the Mass, which, by the way, are variable among the different rites, ever so slightly. those are intimately connected with the deposit of faith in as much as they have to reflect the deposit of faith. But in and of themselves, the specific wording of the canon cannot be considered an article of faith.
Yeah, I know, but it's the meaning, right? And I know this because De Defectibus from from Pius V, he specifically says what you're saying right now, which is that so long as the meaning is not changed, it can be changed, right? If the meaning is changed, then that's wrong. The fact is that the meaning has been changed. There are things within the consecration which have been changed. But we're going off into a rabbit hole on a completely a side issue which isn't related to the debate. But let me ask you this question then.
But with respect to Mysterious Scorpius, by the way, I acknowledge that what he said was true. That obviously, if you don't profess the true faith, then you cannot be considered truly a member of the church. That's a given. However, that is not sufficient to prove that a pope who falls into heresy cannot exercise jurisdiction as pope. Again, with respect to supplied jurisdiction, I think you put a restriction on the scope of supplied jurisdiction that is not actually implied by the definition of supplied jurisdiction. I fail to see how supplied jurisdiction as defined by the church has to be restricted in such a way as to simply refer to the solitary sacramental acts.
I didn't restrict it to particular acts of like performing a sacrament, but it is restricted to particular acts. Like there's a difference between having inherent jurisdiction and supplied jurisdiction, which is that supplied jurisdiction only occurs like I brought up the example of a sacrament because it's one of the easiest ways to explain this, but when supplied jurisdiction is being used, it's like when that excommunicated priest, says some, the form of some sacrament, right? Jurisdiction is supplied, right? But he loses all jurisdiction after that. He only has jurisdiction when he's, acting as an instrument of the Holy Spirit in some situation where it would be permitted, like in some situation where the illicit becomes licit, right? Which is in like extreme circumstances, like near death or whatever. But again, so if you believe then that someone, as according to Mystici Corporis Christi number 22, that when they are outside, when in failing to believe they're outside the church, if you truly believe that, then Leo the 13th in Satis Cognitum number 15 says that it is absurd to imagine that he who is outside the church can command in the church. And the words that Mystici Corporis Christi uses, right? He says that to be included as members of the church, someone who is not a member of the church is outside the church. So you have to profess the true faith to govern within the church. And just let me quote some church fathers, right, on this issue. So we have Saint Cyprian, who says, "We say that all heretics and schismatics have not power and right." Then not only that, but we have this is from Saint Jerome, who says, "Bishops who are heretics cannot continue to be so. Rather, let them be constituted such who were received that were not heretics." And then I'd also like to bring up a final example, which is the example of Nestorius. So Nestorius, who is a bishop, just like the pontiff. The pontiff is just another bishop, right? I'm not denying the fact that he's the head of the universal church, but it's not as though the sacraments are bigger and better in Rome. That's not the case. He is, fundamentally a bishop and beholden to the same thing that all the other bishops are. So, in the case of Nestorius excommunicated various people while he was a heretic, and there was a question of whether or not these people that Nestorius had excommunicated, whether or not they had to be taken
I'm aware
back
with the
in.
case.
Yeah, okay, as lay people. So yeah, and it was determined that, well, because Nestorius was a heretic.
He was deposed by the Council of Ephesus.
Okay, but the issue is that these excommunications occurred before he was
Right, they
was
were
declared a
unjust
heretic.
excommunications.
Okay, the
Pope Celestine could declare that those excommunications.
But how is it unjust if he was your position is that they still maintain jurisdiction even while, so long as they remain in their see, right, and
Right.
have not been deposed, they maintain jurisdiction. Okay, so
But it seems to me that it was Pope Celestine who declared that those excommunications are to be considered null. There's no evidence that, from what I remember from reading the passage, it seems to me that a way to interpret that is that he's saying that, given Pope Celestine's declaration of the fact that Nestorius is a heretic,
okay.
he is not considering those excommunications to be weighty, and the Pope has the authority to do that.
Okay, well, Celestine actually, he justifies the fact that the excommunications weren't valid using my argument, because he says, this is actually the quote from Celestine. He says, if anyone who was either excommunicated or exiled by Bishop Nestorius or any that followed him from such a time as he began to preach such things. So he's saying that as soon as he manifested heresy, that's what
Yeah.
it means to say from such a time, whether they be from the dignity of a bishop or clergy, it is manifest that he has endured and endures in our communion. Nor do we judge him outside, because he could not remove anyone by a sentence who himself had already shown that he must be removed. So he's saying that by virtue of the fact that he himself had already shown himself needing to be removed, they themselves were not removed. Someone who shows themselves to be needing removal, i.e. a heretic, cannot remove others. It's not because of his declaration. He didn't say that he declares them, oh, I declare the excommunications invalid. He doesn't even say that. He just says that by virtue of the fact that he's essentially saying he doesn't have jurisdiction because of his heresy. Right here, that's the direct quote
In virtue
from
of his
Celestine.
heresy, though, in virtue of his heresy, those excommunications which flowed from his capacity as a heretic are to be considered valid. I could agree to that.
Okay, but what he's saying, okay, here's a second. This is Pope Celestine again in a letter to the clergy of Constantinople on this issue. The authority of our see has sanctioned that the bishop, cleric, or Christian, by simple profession, who had been deposed or excommunicated by Nestorius or his followers after the latter began to preach heresy, shall not be considered deposed or excommunicated, for he who had defected from the faith with such preaching cannot depose or remove anyone whatsoever. Okay, he's not even saying even if it were a just excommunication. So even if Nestorius excommunicated someone who was denied the Trinity, it wouldn't have been valid, because he doesn't have supply. He doesn't even have like supply jurisdiction, inherent jurisdiction. He doesn't have jurisdiction because of his heresy. Okay, I don't know how much more clear Pope Celestine can be on this issue.
Can you give me the quotation for that?
Yeah, sure.
The
Here's the source.
Okay.
The source. It's from, it's actually Robert Bellarmine quoting Celestine.
Robert Bellarmine, who said that Nestorius was deposed by the Council of Ephesus?
No, it was Robert Bellarmine citing
No, I know.
Celestine.
Right, well, Robert Bellarmine, from what I've read, pretty sure it also said that Nestorius was actually deposed by the Council of Ephesus,
Well,
but I would have to dig into the...
if that's what he thought, that's in contradiction with what he thought about the Pope. Because if you read chapter 30 of his book on the Roman Pontiff, the whole chapter 30 is dedicated to the fact that the Pope is ipso facto deposed by heresy. That's why he brings up the issue of Nestorius, because
There's
he mentions
a lot of dispute about Robert Bellarmine, of course. It'd be ideal for you to quote him, but I don't know if we want to go down that route.
Yeah, I was just quoting. Okay, I can quote him then, because if we read, okay, in chapter 30 of his book, okay, what he says, which is the link that I just put into the voice chat, okay, what he says is that the fourth opinion is that of Cajetan. The manifestly heretical pope is not ipso facto deposed.
Right.
So that's the opinion that he is going against, okay? And he says, against this, in the first place, if the heretic remain, blah, 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 blah. That's the position that he's arguing against. He's arguing against the position that he's not ipso facto deposed. I would have to read that again,
because I know a lot of non-sedevacantists say the exact opposite, but
Okay,
I would have to read through that again.
Okay.
Anyway,
well,
I do want to get back to the...
I just want to point out that all of those quotations, right, are taken from Bellarmine in this chapter, because I've read through this chapter. It's Bellarmine in this chapter arguing. He uses all of those quotations to argue against the position that a pope is not deposed ipso facto. That he cites church fathers, he cites the example of Nestorius, and he to support his position, right? And my whole thing is that this is the position of Cajetan and others. These are all positions being said before both Mystici Corporis Christi number 22, well, not number 22, but the entire document Mystici Corporis Christi and Satis Cognitum were promulgated. These are people who are talking, who are putting forth their theological positions before we have these two, proclamations on this issue, which makes it abundantly clear, in accordance with church teaching, because, the church teaching cannot change. The Pope is there to safeguard the truth, not to be the arbiter of it. He's there to define it and safeguard it. Okay? In accordance with church tradition, Leo the 13th and Pius the 12th, in their own respect, both put together the fact that it is the case, right, that someone has to govern, to have jurisdiction, okay, they have to profess the true faith. Now, maybe they don't have to profess the true faith to have supplied jurisdiction, okay, but it specifically says that commanding in the church, that if you're outside the church, you can't command in the church. So obviously it's the case then that supplied jurisdiction does not apply in the issue of commanding in the church, which also goes to Pope Celestine's letter to the clergy, where he says, regardless of what the excommunication was, Nestorius's excommunications were invalid, even if they were just. He uses the words whatsoever. Okay, so we know that there's not even jurisdiction supplied. It's not even supplied. There's not inherent or supplied jurisdiction. The Pope ceases to be the Pope upon manifesting heresy, because he's not a member of the church when he does so.
But again, though, even if I were to accept that, discerning whether or not he is or is not a formal heretic truly would have to be established with absolute proof.
Okay.
It would seem to me. And this is because of the first argument that I gave. If you don't have absolute proof, or rather the second argument, if you don't have absolute proof that he is a formal heretic, then how are we to prevent spontaneous schisms? I mean, for example, I'll just give you one example. Let's say that you are living in or around the time of Pius IX, And Pius IX defines the Immaculate Conception as a dogma, right? Now, let's say that you read various earlier popes, such as Pope St. Leo I or Pope Gelasius, who, at least apparently, and many historians regard them to have taught the opposite before it was defined as dogma. And you can read a scripture and come to various interpretations as to the contrary. That would not be the correct reading of scripture, obviously, but it could be an interpretation of scripture that, and various church fathers as well, opposed to the Immaculate Conception. Now, if you take that position at that time, and Pius IX promulgates, defines, pronounces the Immaculate Conception as dogma, what is stopping them from simply discerning him to be a heretic prior to defining the dogma?
Okay. We know that the Immaculate Conception is taught in Scripture. It's not as though the Pope is making
various
something
popes
true.
in the beginning, earlier in the church, a lot of historians read them as not teaching that, as teaching the opposite.
Okay, but that's the issue of error. Like Thomas Aquinas taught the opposite as well. But the fact that you're
right, a lot of people can have the private opinion that these are.
That's not what error is. When you hold a heretical position, but it's not obstinate. Okay, so.
But that's missing the point of what I'm saying. The point of what I'm saying is that someone can, in their private judgment, render a position to be heretical prior to a pope pronouncing it as a dogma. Yeah. Now, if we can have the authority to discern that a pope is a heretic without any declaration from the church, then what can you say to that person? They could be privately, subjectively justified in declaring Pius IX a heretic because he declared something that they have considered to be heretical prior to the definition of it.
Okay.
See, I'm immune from that because even if Pius, I know he wasn't, but even if, although in his earlier years Pius IX did support what was a lot more sympathetic to the liberals, but anyway, even if Pius IX was a heretic, I still am under the conviction that he would be prevented from, if he truly issues an instance of papal infallibility via an ex cathedra definition, he would still be protected by the charism of infallibility, regardless of whether or not he was personally a heretic. And if he was a heretic, then the church would have to establish that fact first and foremost, and then make and discern that the Pope is truly incorrigible, that he cannot be that there is a fundamental incongruity between the church and the Pope, and therefore the church would have the right to sever itself from the Pope. The principle that the Pope, once he becomes a formal heretic, loses within himself the competency to govern the church, that I concede. That it automatically, without the church's sentence, is completely annihilated, that I deny. Because, again, it would render papal infallibility in itself impotent, for the reason that I gave.
Okay, so, I mean, essentially, the issue that I think we're having here is you're acting as though it's the case that, the Pope is there's no way to verify what a Pope says, okay? But that's really not the case. And you also, well, let me finish. There's also an issue of the fact that I think that there's a misunderstanding with infallibility, which I'll address later. But the issue that you put forward basically is you'd begun to say Saint Leo the First and Saint Gelasius. You said that they taught the opposite of the Immaculate Conception.
A lot of historians think that. Yeah.
Okay, before it was defined as dogma. Okay, but this is exactly my point. Why I brought up error earlier. Okay, error is the non-obstinate denial. Okay, of a teaching of the church. To be obstinate requires that even in the face of some authority, okay, and that authority would be the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, you denied anyways. But the issue is that the Immaculate Conception did not have the full force of the magisterium before that point, which is why, for the same reason, Thomas Aquinas, although it's arguable whether or not he actually denied the Immaculate Conception, why, if he did deny the Immaculate Conception, because it was not a dogma, he was merely an error, because there was no authority which one could point to say, look, this is the Catholic teaching, you have to change your mind, or you're obstinate and a heretic, okay? You couldn't point that out, which is why they're merely an error, which is why those examples don't matter if they whether or not they denied it, which I don't actually know whether or not they did, but even if they did, right, and this is an instance before it's defined as dogma, that's merely being an error, because they can't be obstinate, and heresy requires obstinacy. Secondarily, the other thing I just want to point out is the fact that you brought up the issue of Pope Pius IX. Like, what if someone is to conclude that because Pope Leo the First and Pope Gelasius or whatever denied it, okay? Then and they conclude that because of that Pope Pius IX is wrong. Well, the issue is it's not as though we can't actually externally verify it, and we can't actually say that the Bible does teach the Immaculate Conception, or sacred tradition does teach the Immaculate Conception. We can come to these conclusions on our own. And secondarily, the issue...
Then there goes the need for papal infallibility.
Okay, that's not the need. The need for papal infallibility
is to
safeguard truth. The Pope does not determine what is true and what is false. The Pope elevates what is true to the level of dogma, to the level where no one can deny it,
for the
so
sake
that
of
he safeguards it.
For the sake of ending debate on the subject definitively. Right. But on this argument, you would have to, given the hypothetical, you would have to then de-elevate the dogma to a position of disputable debate, because in order to thoroughly refute the person or to completely disregard him, you would have to then debate the issue on its own terms, and papal infallibility itself would become impotent in that regard.
I could prove these people to be wrong, because the Immaculate Conception, believe it or not, is not just taught by the Pope. It's taught in the Bible. The reason why the Pope declares anything dogma, he's not creating anything new. He's not coming
I understand he's not creating
anything defining. Yeah, exactly. So then in what way is that weakening papal infallibility? It's not weakening papal infallibility. What's being done in your position is that we just have to be like irrational, mindless,
No, not irrational.
Like, it's to an extent.
The question of the Immaculate Conception, mind you. I'm saying that in order for papal infallibility to truly have its full competency, we would have to completely discount the possibility that someone could simply disregard it upon discerning him to be a heretic.
No, they couldn't just...
Because they could.
Okay, but that's false discernment. They discern
subjectively
falsely.
They could.
Okay, yeah, but objectively, we believe that there's objective truth. They're just
but subjectively
concerns
wrong. The salvation of truth, or the salvation of souls.
Okay,
here.
Yeah, well, if for example, okay, the Pope puts this forward, right? The Pope Pius IX puts this forward, okay, and we know, okay, we can know that it is true. We can actually look at the Scripture and know that the Immaculate Conception is true, okay, and these people are shown the truth, then they're obstinate heretics. Okay, this in no way weakens papal
It seems to put
infallibility.
the cart before the horse, though.
No, it's the cart is not being put before the horse. Look, the Pope is not okay. The Pope is the vicar of Christ. He's the vice president, not the president. Okay,
Obviously.
he can't just define whatever he wants to.
Well, I'm not saying he can.
Only define the Pope can only define what is true in the realm of faith and in the realm of morals. He can elevate a truth of faith or morals to the level of dogma. Okay, and we can determine, right? We can determine that if, for example, let's say instead of bringing, the Immaculate Conception to the level of dogma, okay, he brings the opposite. He makes it dogmatic that Mary was not immaculately conceived. Within your conception, it's what is true is completely controlled by whatever the Pope says. There's no distinction between what the man who claims to be the pontiff says and what the truth actually is. It's actually the case that that Mary was immaculately conceived. Luke 1:28. We know this. Okay, we know this to be the case. So if Pius IX were to have put forward that Mary was not immaculately conceived, we could also say, I've read Luke 1:28, so many times. I've prayed, my Hail Mary so many times. This guy's wrong. He's wrong. And they would be right in doing that. He is a heretic. A pope could not just go forth and deny, for example, the real presence, or just deny something like that. And just by his denial, reality would start to comport with the Pope. The Pope has to comport to truth and reality, not truth and reality comport to what the Pope says. That's the distinction between my position and yours. And sure, maybe yours is like epistemically stronger because you hold to this worldview where what the Pope says, reality comports to that. But that's not an intellectually honest position to hold.
That's not my position, though. My position is not that the Pope says it, therefore reality has bent to his whim. That's not my position at all. My position is simply that since papal infallibility is pronounced concerning naturally controversial issues in the church, that would mean that an individual who regards a position as contrary to the faith prior to its pronouncement as a dogma could simply regard the Pope who pronounces the dogma as heretical prior to its pronouncement and therefore not yield to it.
Okay, but he's doing so wrongly. Like that's the issue here. Is like if someone is to hold that the Immaculate Conception isn't true, like Thomas, like in the example of Thomas Aquinas does. He actually says, right, what Thomas Aquinas says. Okay, the position that a Catholic is supposed to take, right, is that if the teaching turns out to contradict the true magisterial authority of the church, if it turns out to contradict truth, then he would just assent to that position. The people in the question that you're giving, they're not assenting to the position, and the issue
but in order to discern that papal proclamation as truly a dogma, you have to be committed to the idea that it is a legitimate pope who is pronouncing the dogma. Let's say you held the position of St. Thomas Aquinas prior to Pius IX's proclamation of the dogma, which you could legitimately do back then. Well, let's say you hold it with more firm conviction and regard what earlier popes, again, according to historians, have said on the matter to be of some magisterial weight. That would, again, it would poke a hole in papal infallibility. I truly don't see a way around that. I'll ask a question, and you may think it's it's off topic, but I don't think it is. And depending on your answer, that will determine whether or not we go forward with it. Do you believe that baptism of desire is a heresy?
Yeah, I believe it's a heresy now.
Okay. So let's say that Well, let's say hypothetically, and I know it's hypothetical, and you don't like hypotheticals, but I think it's important. Let's say we did have a true pope right now, and he defined that, and he defined that baptism of desire was not a heresy. In your situation, you would simply have to say, "Oh well, he wasn't the pope to begin with," right?
No, what I would say is that by virtue of him contradicting, the Council of Trent, right? By virtue of contradicting the Council of Trent as well as documents like Unum Sanctum, right? He is a heretic.
Right, and because he's a heretic, he ceases to be pope, and therefore his pronunciation
His
on that point is
his
invalid.
promulgation is invalid. Yeah.
Okay, so again, how is the competency of papal infallibility safeguarded then? If, according to our private reading, and this is, of course, this is a private judgment concerning baptism of desire. There are, if you actually look at the
private judgment,
yes, it is.
It's dogmatic. Both the Council of Trent and Pope
The Council of
Boniface
Trent
VIII.
teaches.
Well, what does the Council of Trent teach?
It has very specific wording regarding the desire of baptism.
Wait. The Council of Trent? Where in the
re
Council of Trent?
voto, or the desire of it.
Wait.
Concerning.
No. Are you talking about the Catechism that came out of that council, or are you talking about the council itself?
No, we could probably talk about this some other time.
Well, the council itself does not talk about baptism of desire. I know what you're referring to. It's the Catechism, and to refute that position is the fact that the church has put forward many documents, has like given a blessing to many documents, like, the Summa, for example, which contain error. Just because the church, gives the document, to, all the parish priests, and tell them to learn this, etc. Just because of that doesn't mean that they're actually like saying that they fully endorse every single teaching of this book, because the church endorses the Summa, but obviously not the parts of the Summa that are in error. But anyways, that's back to a second issue, which is the whole reason why there's such a thing as papal infallibility is because the office of the papacy is preserved from all stain of heresy and schism, okay? Because as soon as someone begins to even attempt to promulgate something that's heretical or schismatic, they are ipso facto deposed. That's what papal infallibility is all about. The institution is infallible, not the man who occupies the institution, right? Because there are certain requirements for him to be in that institution and have the primacy, prerogatives, and privileges which are associated with that institution, mainly that he profess the true faith. Right, and because that's a requirement that he profess the true faith, then it's an infallible institution, right? Because by virtue of him not professing the truth, then he ceases to fulfill the requirements for being in that institution. As I've shown, via Mystici Corporis Christi number 22, Satis Cognitum number 15, the case of Nestorius, and so on, from Pope Celestine. Right, and that's at the Council of Ephesus. Pope Celestine says that. So, and you said that proclamations from councils are dogmatic. So, I don't know how you get away from that one, right? Because Pope Celestine's clearly teaching the position of ipso facto deposition in the case of Nestorius. And even if you think that you can interpret it differently, he clarifies in a separate letter that he is talking about ipso facto deposition. So I don't see how this is weakening in any way papal infallibility. It actually strengthens papal infallibility, because in my mind I can actually hold that all the the encyclicals, the bull, and all the bulls, encyclicals, tomes, etc., councils, when the Pope is speaking, on a matter of faith and morals to the universal church, that it's infallible. And secondarily, I'd also like to point out, how then are we able to determine, that, for example, I don't know, like a robber council would be invalid, right? Because if we believe that, you can have, infallible statements two ways, which is one, via, if we understand infallibility in the way that you understand it, then essentially we would not be able to call a robber council such as the Second Council of Ephesus a robber council, because if we understand infallibility to mean, by virtue of it being promulgated, it's infallible, who's to say that the council, of the Second Council of Ephesus, like how can that be measured? How we can't externally verify it with your view of infallibility. We are just supposed to take it, de fide, as a matter of faith, that it's just infallible, and we wouldn't be able to come to that conclusion that the Second Council of Ephesus is invalid if that weren't the case. Right, and then the Pope who declared the Second Council of Ephesus to be invalid would be contradicting your concept of infallibility.
It would not be contradicting my concept of infallibility, because with respect to church councils, those have to be, their infallibility is retained via specifically ecumenical councils of the bishops in communion with the Pope on various points. Isn't that right? I mean,
yeah, and the bishops in communion with the Pope all promulgated this, right? But we were able to discern the fact that it was a robber council because, Dioscorus, who was the patriarch of, I believe, Antioch at the time.
Yeah.
He had, Monophysites attack the papal legates. So the papal legates were there, right? And the council was approved with the consent of the papal legates. Right, but
not the Pope himself, was it?
Okay, but we know that the Pope doesn't actually need to. We know that the Pope doesn't actually need to be there for a council to be promulgated as valid, because there are many councils that the Pope wasn't even at. Right, and in this case, he sent legates. Right, but in your view, right, how would we be able to determine that the legates, that because of the fact that the legates were, kind of forcefully made to accept this council, that would make it invalid, right? Because aren't we just supposed to accept the infallibility of things de fide?
It doesn't have... I wouldn't think it would have infallibility simply by virtue of the legates.
Okay, well then if that's the case, then all the councils that the Pope was not actually present at, which there are many councils where this is the case, and he only sent legates, then it would be the case that none of those councils are binding, which I don't think is a position you'd like to take.
Well, I don't understand how you can accept that position either, because clearly the Pope was valid at the time.
Well, I don't see how this is a problem for me. This isn't an issue for me. I don't have any issue. Look, fundamentally, the issue here is that I don't believe that a Pope can utter heresy by virtue of the fact that he is outside the church by doing this. And now we're at an issue, right, of where you're saying that can't be the case. You're using kind of like a reductio ad absurdum, which is that it can't be the case because then, how would infallibility even work in that scenario? Okay, but the issue is that it doesn't affect infallibility. Like, there's not... Infallibility works by virtue of the fact that the institution of the papacy can never be stained by heresy or schism. Not that the man who occupies the institution can never be stained by heresy or schism. Because to say that a man is infallible doesn't make sense. That just logically doesn't make sense.
The man has the charism. It's a charism of infallibility.
From the institution. He only gets it from the institution. He's not infallible before or after, or he's not infallible when he's acting outside of that institution. He's only infallible when he's acting as the Pope. It's not the man himself, because the man himself is not infallible. It's the institution, right? Because if he's not speaking as the Pope, he's not infallible. He has to have that there. And so therefore, it is entirely the case that the man who occupies the papacy could utter heresy, and by uttering heresy, he ceases to fulfill the requirements to occupy that institution, which gives him, the jurisdiction and the primacy, privileges, and prerogatives, as well as the, the charisms which are associated with that. Okay, he ceases, to be the Pope, thus saving the institution of the stain, or I believe some 5th century Pope said that, the Roman See is saved from all wrinkle
But
or
that
stain or whatever.
that
Right?
does not save the integrity of the institution at all. It would, again, simply regard heresy versus orthodoxy as discernible by inferiors.
Okay, it is discernible because we're not. Okay, this is an issue. Okay, I think an issue that you're gonna get. When I say that a given pope is an anti-pope, that's not my authority. It's by the authority of the dogmas which I'm citing, and of the scripture which I'm citing, and etc. Right? Like, for example, when it is the case that, the Fourth Lateran Council says to receive, support, or defend heretics makes one a heretic, and I say, Pope X, received, and prayed with, a bunch of non-Catholics, right? And I'd say that makes him a heretic. That's not by my authority that I'm judging.
Oh, so you
him.
think that if
That's
a pope prays with heretics, that makes him not pope?
Yeah, according to the Fourth Lateran Council.
So
but that's outside the scope of the
did
debate.
Pius XI omit the Filioque in 1925 when praying with the Orthodox?
Yeah, okay. That's because omitting the Filioque, you don't need the Filioque there. The old creed
In order
is not
to
heretical.
appease. Well, no, the old creed is not heretical, but once the Filioque was added to the creed, that was a statement
because-
that the Filioque is of the faith. So when you admit it,
Well,
subsequently
now
you
we're
are-
dealing with what was going on in his mind at the time, what made him do it.
This
And
is
at
the
that
whole
point, it's
Well, what is going on in the mind of
Okay,
the
this
man
is-
at
this
the
is
time? That's
outside the
literally
scope of the debate
as appealing
anyway.
to every
This
single
is
pope
not
that
the
you claim
debate.
is a heretic.
This is outside the scope of the debate anyway.
When we quote historical instances of popes, that's certainly circumstantial history, isn't it?
Okay, well, that's not the issue of this debate is not on whether or not a given pope or set of popes or whatever is valid. The scope of this debate is you define the debate. You define the
Well, if
times
Pius
even of the
XI
debate.
wasn't
Okay, all right.
right, but
so,
if
all
Pius
right,
XI
if you-
wasn't
look,
the pope,
I'm
then
not.
Pius
I'm
XII
not
would
going.
have
I'm
been.
not going to
And
debate
that
something that's
encyclical you quoted
outside
at one point.
the scope of the debate because you came up with the resolution for this debate. I'm prepared for the resolution of this debate. I'm not, prepared for the goalposts being shifted to another debate of, whether or not a given pope is a heretic or not. The issue is what happens in the instance that a pope is a heretic, okay?
Mhm.
And my position still stands, okay? And let me ask you 2 questions, okay? Do you believe that someone who... Well, do you believe that to be a member of the church, you have to, 1, be baptized, and 2, profess the Catholic faith?
Yeah.
Okay. And then do you believe that you have to be a member of the church to govern within the church?
Not absolutely
Okay.
speaking.
Well, Pope Leo the 13th absolutely says...
The context of that encyclical has to do with, I'm pretty sure it has to do with people who are defecting from the papacy as an institution. That's the whole context of what he's writing about there.
Okay,
I've read that section.
So in what other context can we understand this when he says, "No one, therefore, unless in communion with Peter, can share in his authority, since
In
it
communion
is
with
absurd."
Peter.
Okay,
Yes.
Okay. Since
And the context of being outside the church in that regard is placing yourself outside of the jurisdiction of the Pope,
Okay,
from
which
which
a
the font
heretic
of jurisdiction flows.
which a heretic
Okay.
would do when you cease to profess the true faith.
And I'm pretty
you
sure the word
cease to be in
publicly is in there,
communion.
isn't it?
when
No,
he
this is the direct quote. No one, therefore, unless in
I mean,
communion with
around
Peter,
that
can
quote.
share in his authority, since it is absurd to imagine that he who is outside can command in the church. Look, I don't understand in what other way you can. Okay, maybe he's like he is specifically says, right? He says that the reason why someone who's not in communion with the church can't govern within the church, or cannot share his authority, is for this reason. So this is a completely separate fact. The fact is, he says the reason why they can't is because of this fact, which is that it is absurd to imagine that he who is outside can command in the church. Okay, someone who does not profess the true faith or is not baptized is not inside the church. Okay,
But contextually, it has to do with sharing in the jurisdiction of
can
the
you
Pope.
cite that? Can you explain how I'm
The whole
taking this out of
paragraph is
context?
having to do with the primacy of Peter. That's the whole context of that paragraph, has to do with the
Okay,
primacy
and
of the Pope in jurisdiction.
And how does that take away from the fact that you have to be a member of the church to govern within the church? Because it's quite clear that Pope Celestine also says a very similar thing, right? Pope Celestine says that he who let me see what the quote from Celestine is. For he who had defected from the faith with such preaching cannot depose or remove any whatsoever, right? So defected from the faith with such preaching, meaning that he ceased to profess the true faith. Or, okay, Bishop Nestorius, he's talking about him again. He says, from such time as he had begun to preach such things, right? Okay, so as soon as he ceased to profess the true faith. I'm not taking that out of context. There's no context in which you can understand it that Leo the 13th didn't actually mean what I'm saying he meant and what he wrote, okay? There's no surrounding context in which you can interpret that in the opposite way.
I'm not interpreting it in the opposite way.
You are, because he's saying that it's absurd that anyone who's outside the church can command within it, and you're saying that someone who is outside the church can command within it, right? That's your position.
Well, with respect to...
Is that or is that not your position, that someone who's outside the church can command within it?
Well, he certainly has no right to command from within it. But again, jurisdiction can be supplied or it can be from within.
You believe that
and
someone
I think
who is
that
outside
the
look, you are obstinately denying this truth, which both Leo and Celestine are putting forward because you want to maintain the
First of all, I don't
position
think
that
that Leo has done so dogmatically. I don't think that's been established.
you think that just because it's not dogmatic, you don't have to follow it. So you take like a recognize and resist sort of position, which again, we would both agree that it's not licit to resist the teachings of the true pope.
There are several things that popes have said in the history of the church that we could not fully assent to. Like, for example, Boniface VIII in Unum Sanctum clearly did seem to espouse the theory of the two swords. And that's something that was contradicted by Leo XIII in Immortality Dei. So we can't accept the theory of the two swords. And yet we also have to be in conformity with what, for example, what Leo XIII said regarding stately authority with respect to ecclesiastical authority.
Okay, well, I mean, I don't think that there's any clear or apparent contradiction in Unum Sanctum with Leo the
Boniface,
13th.
It's common knowledge that Boniface VIII taught the two swords theory.
Okay. I would like you. I mean, all I would have to say is that at a separate time, I'd like you to prove that Leo the 13th contradicted Pope Boniface VIII. I mean, I think you'd have a really hard time doing that.
No, it's very clear that Leo XIII rejected the two swords theory.
Okay, well then, after this debate, you can prove to me.
I'll have to get you that citation. And not only that, there's countless other examples. My point is that
You
haven't
cannot.
been able to provide any of these countless other examples. You've had no citations. You've asked me for citations. I've
Pope
provided
Gregory,
many citations.
Pope Gregory the Seventh, Dictatus Papae 23, he says that the Roman Pontiff, if he has been canonically ordained, is undoubtedly made a saint by the merit of Saint Peter. That's not true, is it?
Well, that's in Dictatus Papae. What number?
23.
Which principle?
23. Martin V and Eugene IV assented to the heretical document Haec Sancta at the Council of Constance, which advocated the conciliarist heresy. Okay, I mean, there are things that popes have done in the history of the papacy that were not done in their capacity as popes, as ex cathedra pronouncements, that we cannot. And again, Pope Nicholas I.
Wait. Is Dictatus Papae?
Okay.
Is this even like a true? Is this even a true document? Because
it's look it up. Dictatus Papae.
Well, it was okay. So it was never published. I just want to say that it was not published. Dictatus Papae. So, or at least what I'm reading now. I mean, I've never even heard of Dictatus Papae, and according to this article, I mean, it's being like, it was published as a collection of decretals dedicated to Pope Victor VIII that embodied the law of the Church, the canon law, which he had compiled from many other sources, both legitimate and false. So it was included with the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. So I mean, I don't really even know the legitimacy of this document, and it seems to have come at a time when stating such things, ultramontanistic things, such as that would have been, done to bolster, the position. But, I've never even heard of Dictatus Papae.
Well, again, we could just go back to Pope Nicholas I, where he clearly said that baptism in the name of Christ would be a valid baptism. And again, Boniface VIII, Unum Sanctum. We can go over that later.
But that doesn't even disprove my position, because if it is the case that any of these people uttered heresy, right? It doesn't matter if they did utter heresy. From what we know, given to other dogmas, right? They are then, by virtue of their heresy, deposed.
I just think that what I have said
because we're
lends credence to the position that your interpretation of papal infallibility is way too expansive.
Okay. Well, I really don't see that as an actual objection.
Because
you
don't see it as an actual objection.
Yeah, it's not an actual objection, because that has no. Where in dogma or where in scripture does it say that my idea of papal infallibility being too expansive is, like a wrong position to hold? Like, my position is, I've been able to cite various okay, but the issue is you can say that there's some sort of a logical problem with that, but is there any dogma against what I'm doing with infallibility? I mean, because I can cite various dogmas, various papal letters, proclamations from councils, the opinions of church fathers on why what you hold to is wrong. But the idea that what you're putting forward and accusing me of is that my understanding of infallibility is wrong. But is there any dogma or anything that backs up your understanding of infallibility versus mine, or condemns mine? At the very least, there isn't a condemnation of my understanding of infallibility, and I would say that my understanding of infallibility follows from the First Vatican Council and follows from the teachings, of the various church fathers and, of Mystici Corporis Christi and Satis Cognitum.
I think that your understanding of papal infallibility is too expansive, precisely because of what was laid out in Vatican I. It clearly says, when the Pope, 1, intends to teach, 2, by virtue of his supreme authority, 3, on a matter of faith and morals, 4, to the whole church, he is preserved by the Holy Spirit from error. And it seems to me that if you're simply going to say that the mere statement of a papal teaching.
So you admit that you're in contradiction of these papal teachings, and now your argument. Now
Well, I don't fully know.
Now you're arguing that these aren't actually infallible teachings.
Well, I've started
Okay,
from the beginning that they're not infallible
because
teachings.
you know that you're in contradiction of them.
But
also the other thing to point out is that I don't see how in any way it is the case that that these don't meet the requirements for being dogmatic. Like there are so many things like there's so many teachings of the Catholic Church which like don't I don't even know what language would be required, what language you're requiring, because as far as I'm aware, these are popes who are fulfilling all the requirements of the First Vatican Council, because they are, as the pontiff, defining to the universal church something to be held and believed universally. Okay, like that is the point of an encyclical or of a bull. Like what documents then are infallible, or what magic phrase makes something infallible? There is none, because that's not how the church has ever had it. And if that is the case, then right, like before the First Vatican Council, did people believe that there were many more dogmas, and then after the First Vatican Council people were just like, oh, all these things aren't actually dogmatic, right? Like what obviously it's not the case that what you're putting forward, that there's some criteria or some certain words that have to be said to be making something dogmatic. But I think what we're kind of circling around back and forth now. We're covering issues that we've already covered before. So if we want to wrap it up now, I'll let you make your last statement, and I may or may not respond to that, and then that'll just be the end of it.
All right, then. Well, again, my final statement is simply that I think your arguments are entirely contingent upon an overexpansive view of papal infallibility, which I think is reserved to, as the First Vatican Council says, when the Roman Pontiff speaks ex cathedra, that is, when in virtue of his office as shepherd and teacher of all Christians, in virtue of his supreme apostolic authority, he defines a doctrine concerning faith and morals to be held by the whole church he possesses by the divine sense of the Son. I believe that has to be intended for the specific proposition that the Pope intends to be defined. Otherwise, it is either ordinary magisterium, which can in principle be errant, but would ordinarily require the assent of intellect and will. And I think since your entire argument rests on that overexpansive, in my view, view of papal infallibility, I don't think that is sufficient to prove the resolution, and I think the resolution is contradicted by the logical arguments that I laid out that would, I think, render papal infallibility as such impotent and would cause an epistemic crisis as to the validity of any given pontificate. And I think that if we take your position seriously, there's a very real possibility that we've been in sedevacantist since the Middle Ages.
Okay. Well, just finally is to say that your standard for something being ex cathedra, I just think is arbitrary, whereas mine actually follows, which is that when the Pope is teaching on a matter of faith and morals. Good night, love you. Good night, love you. Leave me alone. I'm doing something right now. When the Pope is teaching on a matter of faith and morals, therefore that makes it, that it is infallible when he's teaching to the universal church on a matter of faith and morals. That's not an arbitrary standard. That's the standard that's put forward in the document. The standard that, you can't even tell me, what would be required. How would we know? Does he have to say, I'm defining right now? And that's rhetorical. But just in closing, all I have to say is that if you actually believe that what Leo the 13th and Pius the 12th put forward is true, then you do have to hold to my position. And I don't think that it is the case, right, that that papal infallibility doesn't extend to Pope Leo the 13th and Pope Pius the 12th when they're teaching on these matters, which are matters of faith and morals, right? So long as they're on faith and morals to the universal church, they're defining, matters of faith and morals, then it's infallible. And I think that if you really want to talk about like epistemic weakness, you have real epistemic weakness when there's like, we can't even determine which one's dogmatic or not, because you have this weird standard of, it's not like by virtue of him just writing it, that is he's defining something to be believed by all, and by him defining it and promulgating it by virtue of doing that. But that apparently isn't sufficient. So then it comes to the case, like almost everything is in question then, right? How do we know whether anything is ex cathedra or not? And because the only documents which are explicitly said to be ex cathedra, there are only two of them, right? And it's on the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption. So then do we only have two dogmas? And I'll actually let you respond to that, because that was a pretty long-winded closing, but that's all I really have to say, and I won't respond after that, just to save the length of this.
I mean, well, that's okay. I don't really need to, because I can't think of the explicit examples on the top of my head, but there have been instances other than papal, or other than the Immaculate Conception and the Assumption, where the Pope has explicitly listed his intention to define a particular matter of faith and morals, and defining, having the express intention to define a matter of faith and morals is something that is intrinsic to the parameters of infallibility. That's all I'll say.
Alrighty, well, I think that concludes it.